don't know what happened today because it was yesterday that I saw him. Yeah, I bet they came back. Yeah, we were close to each other. Because he had an accent like said like Russian to Polish would be. Yeah, so this Polish guy, he's being sound. Yeah, that's what he did. So maybe it was the same. Yeah, that's what it sounds like. He was calling them Nazis in the shop. Yeah, it was posted today, or maybe they just it was Dinesh Souza. Reposted it, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, I saw that. I'm not sure what's the town hall. That's one that I looked at. Then there's several others they can. Yeah, that was. Don't come back unless you got a warrant. Yeah. And the video was, they kept trying to say something. He just, I don't want to hear what you're saying. Just get out. Get out. Just stop. They finally did because they were inside the building. Good. Yeah, right on. So that is an easy help. Okay. Yeah, we didn't really say where it was at. The video didn't work. It was just sound. I think it was the guy himself. Jason Hall. He videoed them, and after he turned around, there were two short ones, and they turned around and they talked for a few minutes. Yeah, I'd be interested if they followed that up at all, if they came and cracked down on him, or if they knew better. Just let him be. Always good. Good morning. Do you have any prayer requests or announcements before we get started? Yes.
Matt and Howard are going in the weather, and Rebecca and Howard decided to stay the night in the valley last night, so they could drive home this year. So just prayers for their big crowd. Well, yeah, they were supposed to come back. They decided to stay in the walls and, but it's going to go, but if the temperature stays up, it's just wet. And they're smart enough.
Anything else? Okay, Danny, would you like to lead us in prayer?
Would you bow with me? Dear Lord and Father in heaven, we're very thankful for this day that we can gather together to study your word and seek your word and understand it, put it in our hearts. We're thankful, Father, for the gift of life through your Son. We're thankful that he has risen. We're thankful that we have your word that tells us all of this. Pray that you would be with all of our church family, those that are traveling, those that are sick, that you'd be with each one of them according to their needs, Father. Pray that you'd be with Ben as he brings a lesson to us this morning, and that he would be able to
Help us to understand your word better. And we're thankful that he has put the effort into that. We ask that you would be with us now, Father, as we go to you in your word. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you. So we're in 2 Samuel 19 this morning. In the last few chapters, we've seen Absalom's revolt against David and the results of that, how that played out. Chapter 15, we saw that revolt and saw David fleeing Jerusalem. And then David ends up in the city of Mahanaim on the east side of the Jordan in chapter 17. And then in chapter 18 there, David's men defeat the men of Israel in a battle in the woods of Ephraim, there near Mahanaim. And Absalom is killed by Joab and by his armor bearers after he gets caught in the tree by his hair. And here at the end of chapter 18, we see David gets the news that Absalom is dead. And he had instructed his captains to deal gently with Absalom back in 18, verse 5. So he had told his captains in front of everyone to deal gently with Absalom. He gets the news here at the end of 18, and we see him weeping and mourning for Absalom. And that continues here in the first few verses of 19. So I'll read these first few verses, or go back to 33. So David gets the news there that Absalom has been killed. And verse 33, and the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son, Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. And it was told Joab, behold, the king weepeth and mourneth for Absalom. And the victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people. For the people heard say that day how the king was grieved for his son. And the people gat them by stealth that day into the city, as people being ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. But the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, O my son, Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. So we see David's grief for Absalom's death. And of course, the cause of his death goes back to the consequences of David's own sin. So that certainly is compounding his grief, the circumstances under which Absalom has died, the whole way that played out. But going back into chapter 12, starting in verse 9, of course, here, after David sinned and Nathan has confronted David about it, this is Nathan speaking. Wherefore hast thou despised the commandment of the Lord, to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife, and hast slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this son. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, and before the sun. So we see this consequence of what David had done. So that's compounding his grief. And then starting there in verse 5 through 7. And Joab came into the house to the king and said, Thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants, which this day have saved thy life, and the lives of thy sons and thy daughters, and the lives of thy wives, and the lives of thy concubines, in that thou lovest thine enemies and hatest thy friends. For thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants. For this day I perceive that if Absalom had lived, and all we had died this day, then it had pleased thee well. Now therefore, arise, go forth, and speak comfortably unto thy servants. For I swear by the Lord, if thou go not forth, there will not tarry one with thee this night, and that will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now. So we have this very strong rebuke of David by Joab, and he's correct in what he's saying here. Absalom certainly would have killed at least the men. So in Absalom meeting his end there, they've saved David's lives and the lives of his people there. And David here was being a terrible leader in the way that he showed his grief before the people with no appreciation for for their loyalty to them. He was just totally caught up in his grief. And that, of course, is what Joab rebukes him for. To look at a couple of verses here, go back to 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 15, starting in verse 35. Okay, and this is where Saul has been rejected by God. And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thy horn with oil and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. So you have there, God says to Samuel, it's time to stop mourning for Saul. He's been rejected. So that mourning there that Samuel was doing at that point, it became inappropriate. And if you look back at Leviticus chapter 10, in the death here of Nadab and Abihu. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer, and put fire therein, and put incense thereon, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Lord, and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said unto Aaron, This is it that the Lord spake, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come nigh me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. And Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Uzziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said unto them, Come near, carry your brethren from before the sanctuary out of the camp. So they went near and carried them. Excuse me. So they went near and carried them in their coats out of the camp, as Moses had said. And Moses said unto Aaron, and unto Eleazar, and unto Ithamar his sons, Uncover not your heads, neither rend your clothes, lest ye die, and lest wrath come upon all the people. But let your brethren, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning which the Lord hath kindled. So Aaron and his other sons there were instructed not to do the acts of mourning for Nadab and Abihu here, although the other people were able to mourn for them. So just a couple examples there of some inappropriate mourning. And of course, it was certainly appropriate for David to feel sorry that his son had died, but he should have seen the effect of that on the other people. In this verse 7, in the King James, it says, Now arise, go forth, and speak comfortably unto thy servants. A literal translation is that it speak to the heart of thy servants. And what we have here is that David is about to lose the hearts of the people that have remained loyal to him. And of course, we saw back in 15:6, said that Absalom had stolen the hearts of the rest of Israel from David. So this idea of the heart of the people, the people were, they'd had this victory. They'd been loyal to David, and they were victorious. And then David is simply mourning his son here, and with no regard for this victory. And so then they're like ashamed, kind of sneaking back into the city in shame because the king's son is dead and he's losing their hearts. And you see through this with Absalom's revolt and throughout this the importance of the king having the heart of the people. So Joab says, speak to the hearts of the people. And that idea, some translations I think say, speak kindly, speak comfortably, but the literal word there is to speak to their heart. So in verse 8, you see that David listened to Joab and sat in the gate of the city. Then the king arose and sat in the gate, and they told unto all the people, saying, Behold, the king doth sit in the gate. And all the people came before the king, for Israel had fled every man to his tent. So he's sitting in the gate there now as a king should after a victory, and the people came before him. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, then verses 9 and 10. And all the people were at strife throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, The king saved us out of the hand of our enemies, and he delivered us out of the hand of the Philistines, and now is fled out of the land for Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now therefore, why speak ye not a word of bringing the king back? So Israel had here to decide what to do about a king. They'd made Absalom king, and David had fled. But now Absalom's dead, so now they're remembering the good that David had done for him, how he delivered them out of the hand of the Philistines. And so now the talk is to bring David back as king. And then David hears this. This is throughout Israel, all the tribes of Israel are saying, why don't we bring back David as king? And King David sent to Zadok and to Abiathar the priests, saying, Speak unto the elders of Judah, saying, Why are ye the last to bring the king back to his house, seeing the speech of all Israel is come to the king, even to his house? Ye are my brethren, ye are my bones and my flesh. Wherefore then are ye the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, Art thou not of my bone and of my flesh? God do so to me, and more also, if thou be not captain of the host before me continually in the room of Joab. And he bowed the heart of all the men of Judah, even as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word unto the king, Return thou and all thy servants. So the king returned and came to Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to go to meet the king, to conduct the king over Jordan. So David had heard of the talk throughout Israel, what they're saying about bringing him back as king. So he sends word to the tribe of Judah, asking why they aren't calling for his return as king, since he's of their tribe. And here in verse 13, among this, he says that he will make Amasa the captain of the army in the place of Joab. And here you see a place in the King James, the word is host for army. And as you see, so many places, the Lord of hosts, that means the Lord of armies. So the host is the army. Absalom had made Amasa captain of the army that pursued David and was defeated by his men. So he's taking the captain of the army that had rebelled against him and saying, I'm going to make you captain of my army in the place of my captain that defeated your army, and who really had saved David from Absalom. Now you might see in this here even that David is displeased with Joab. Of course, Joab was the one that had actually killed Absalom, And Joab had given him this harsh rebuke, but those things were both to David's benefit. And now he's making the traitor the captain of the army. Now, I would suppose his purpose is to unite, to bring back the ones that had rebelled against him, and by making their captain his captain, showing that everything's forgiven there. But it doesn't turn out well in any sense here in the next chapters.
I think part of the problem is I continue to see that David is just doing like men do rather than following God. He's not seeking God's counsel on where he always sought God's counsel before, and he's not doing that now.
Yeah, he certainly doesn't appear to be. If back in 1725, you see that Absalom made Amasa captain of the host instead of Joab, which Amasa was a man's son whose name was Ithra, an Israelite, that went into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister to Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So you see all the family connections here as well. Amasa and Joab were cousins, and they were David's nephews. They were both the same relation to David. They were David's sister's sons. So they're both David's nephews, both sons of his two sisters. And we see in the next chapter that Amasa does not do well, and Joab puts an end to that arrangement. And here in verse 14, you see that David bowed the heart of all the men of Judah. So now David has the hearts of Judah as well as the northern tribe. So Israel is uniting behind the king. He's getting the hearts of the people, and he's waiting here until he has that before he tries to become king. Even though he's won the battle, he's defeated them, but he's letting the people make him the king. Which he is being wise to allow that to happen, to allow the people. He's making some unwise decisions, like Danny said, apparently not consulting God for some of these. But in this, he's wise in waiting until he has the hearts of the people. And you see that that concept there of a leader having the hearts of his people, and which we have. Even here you have these kings that exercise this power over the people, and the power of life and death, as you see in coming in some of the next chapters, some of these decisions that people are just able to be their lives ended by the kings. They have this power, they're appointed there by God, but still you have that concept of ruling by the consent of the people, which we have in that idea in our own government. In our Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So that idea of the consent of the governed, you see bits of that here, and that certainly comes from the scriptural idea that the government comes from the bottom up. And so at the end of what I just read there in verse 15, you see David has come down from Mahanaim to the Jordan, and Judah has come to Gilgal on the other side of the Jordan. So He's come down. Gilgal's a little further, or Mahanaim's a little further north and away from the Jordan. And he's come down there, and Gilgal's pretty close to Jordan on the other side. So he's preparing to cross that Jordan. That's significant. The king returning, of course, heading back to Jerusalem, and it's a big deal here, crossing the Jordan to head back to Jerusalem. So now in verse 16 through 22. And Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, who was of Bahurim, hasted and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. And there were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons and his 20 servants with him. And they went over Jordan before the king. And there went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household, and to do what he thought good. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king, as he was come over Jordan, and said unto the king, Let not my lord impute iniquity unto me, neither do thou remember that which thy servant did perversely the day that my lord the king went out of Jerusalem, that the king should take it to his heart. For thy servant doth know that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I am come the first this day of all the house of Joseph to go down to meet my lord the king. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered and said, Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? And David said, What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah, that I should this day be that ye should this day be adversaries unto me? Shall there any man be put to death this day in Israel? For do not I know that I am this day king over Israel? Therefore the king said unto Shimei, Thou shalt not die. And the king sware unto him. So let's go back. That's chapter 16. And take a look at what Shimei is speaking of here, or what they're all speaking of here. Chapter 16, starting in verse 5. And of course, this is when David is leaving Jerusalem, fleeing from Absalom. And when King David came to Bahurim, behold, thence came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came forth and cursed still as he came. And he cast stones at David and at all the servants of King David. And all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, Come out, thou bloody man, and thou man of Belial. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. Then said Abishai the son of Zeruiah unto the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. And the king said, What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord hath said unto him, Curse David. Who shall say then, Wherefore hast thou done so? And David said to Abishai and to all his servants, Behold, my son, which came forth of my bowels, seeketh my life. How much more now may this Benjamite do it? Let him alone, and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and that the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. And as David and his men went by the way, Shimei went along on the hillside over against him, and cursed as he went, and threw stones at the king, threw stones at him, and cast dust. So we see what Shimei had done there. And here, when you read that, Shimei seems sort of inconsequential. He's referred to as a dead dog there. He seems like a crazy man throwing rocks and dust. But here in chapter 19, we see he has 1,000 men following him. So he's a man of some consequence. And of course, he's of the family of Saul. And now he sees with David's return, he goes and asks for David's forgiveness. In verse 21, you have Abishai. He once again wants to kill him. He's the one that wanted to kill him before. And he and Joab, here are the sons of Zeruiah, David's sister. It's interesting Usually men are called by the names of their fathers, the son of so-and-so, but here these ones are, of course, it's David's sister, so that makes sense, but they're always referred to as the sons of Zeruiah. It's interesting here, David says, let's see which verse that was, 22, that ye should this day be adversaries unto me. And the word adversaries there is the word Satan, which Satan just means adversary, so it's a completely correct translation. But that is the word Satan, where the name Satan comes from, because he is the adversary. And of course, that's a reminder in that idea. He's saying, why should you be adversaries to me? Why should you be Satan to me? And then when you think of Jesus saying to Peter, get behind me, Satan, in that being an adversary in that way. Of course, David swears to him in verse 23 that he'll not be killed. But David didn't forget about what had happened, as we will see in future chapters. There in 1 Kings chapter 2, you can read about how that happens. He gives instructions to Solomon to deal with him, and Solomon does not put him to death for this, but Solomon sets up another situation that Shimei breaks Solomon's rule and ends up being put to death for that. So he is punished for this through Solomon, and David let him live this time, but he didn't forget what he had done. But this was not a day for punishments. This was a day this was a day of victory and celebration. So it was not a day to be putting someone to death. And we had seen here in verse 17 that Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons and his 20 servants had come there also. And so let's read about them here starting in 20, or read a reference to them here in 24, dealing with them as Mephibosheth as he gets to Jerusalem. So verse 24, and Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, and had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes, from the day the king departed until the day he came again in peace. And it came to pass, when he was come to Jerusalem to meet the king, that the king said unto him, wherefore wentest thou not with me, Mephibosheth? And he answered, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For thy servant said, I will saddle me an ass, that I may ride thereon, and go to the king, because thy servant is lame. And he hath slandered thy servant unto my lord the king. But my lord the king is as an angel of God. Do therefore what is good in thine eyes. For all of my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. Yet didst thou set thy servant among them that did eat at thine own table. What right, therefore, have I to cry any more unto the king? And the king said unto him, why speakest thou any more of thy matters? I have said, thou and Ziba divide the land. And Mephibosheth said unto the king, yea, let him take all, forasmuch as my lord the king is come again in peace to his own house. So we see here Mephibosheth's version of what had happened with him. If you look back, I don't have the reference there, but Ziba had said that Mephibosheth had stayed in Jerusalem and was hoping that the kingdom would be returned to him, since he is the descendant of Saul. This speaks of him as the son of Saul, which is correct, but he is the grandson of Saul because he is the son of Jonathan. And of course, David took him into his house as he had sworn to Jonathan that he would remember him and his friendship through his descendants. And so had taken Mephibosheth into his house, and he sat and ate with the king But he had remained in Jerusalem. Ziba had left him behind and said that he'd stayed there on purpose. So Mephibosheth said that he had been slandered by Ziba. And David had then given all of the possessions to Ziba, everything that Mephibosheth had owned. We have the evidence that Mephibosheth's version is correct, in that he had been in mourning the time that the king was gone. He hadn't taken care of his feet or trimmed his beard or washed his clothes. So he had the evidence that he was in mourning there, that his story was correct rather than Ziba's. In verse 29, the judgment that David makes is simply to divide the land. David had given Mephibosheth's land to Ziba in chapter 16. That's where that whole thing took place. And here he said, you'll just divide it. Rather than try and figure out who's telling the truth and everything that's right, he simply divides the land between the two of them. In verse 30, Mephibosheth's answer is just let him take it all. My understanding of this is the way it'd be the customs of negotiating things, or even king giving you this judgment, then you speak that you're willing to have even less. Say this is more than fair. Let him have it all. Doesn't necessarily mean that he actually gave his share to Ziba. That's my understanding of it anyway, from things that I've read. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Okay. It seems like this isn't exactly chronological because it speaks of this taking place in Jerusalem, but here back in verse 31, we're back at the Jordan again and his crossing, which has been the context here from back about verses 15 and 16. So starting here in verse 31. And Barzillai the Gileadite came down from Rogelim and went over Jordan with the king to conduct him over Jordan. Now Barzillai was a very aged man, even 80 years old, and he had provided the king of sustenance while he lay at Mahanaim, for he was a very great man. And the king said unto Barzillai, Come thou over with me, and I will feed thee with me in Jerusalem. And Barzillai said unto the king, How long have I to live, that I should go up with the king unto Jerusalem? I am this day 80 years old, and can I discern between good and evil? Can thy servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I hear any more the voice of singing men and singing women? Wherefore then should thy servant be yet a burden unto my lord the king? Thy servant will go a little way over Jordan with the king. And why should the king recompense it me with such a reward? Let thy servant, I pray thee, turn back again, that I may die in mine own city, and be buried by the grave of my father and my mother. But behold, thy servant Chimham, let him go over with my lord the king, and do to him what shall seem good unto thee. And the king answered, Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do to him that which shall seem good unto thee, and whatsoever thou shalt require of me, that I will do for thee. And all the people went over Jordan. And when the king was come over, the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned unto his own place. Then the king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went on with him. And all the people of Judah conducted the king, and also half the people of Israel. So back in chapter 17, 27, you see what Barzillai there had done for him. And it came to pass when David was come to Mahanaim, that Shobi, the son of Nahash of Rabbah, of the children of Ammon, and Machir, the son of Amiel of Lodebar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite of Rogelim, brought beds and basins and earthen vessels, and wheat and barley and flour, and parched corn, and beans, and lentils, and parched pulse, and honey and butter, and sheep, and cheese of kine, for David and for the people that were with him to eat. For they said, the people is hungry, and weary, and thirsty in the wilderness. So you see what Barzillai and some others had provided for them while they were in Mahanaim. So it was what he'd done for David was very important there. And of course, everyone who helped David was taking a risk for him as well. If David had lost, they probably would have suffered the consequences of supporting him. Possibly they would have. So we see that David here wants to honor him and repay him for his help, and take him into his household there and provide for him in Jerusalem. And we see that Barzillai does not want this because of his age. He's saying he wants to die in his own home and be buried there. He says he's not even in a position to enjoy what David could provide for him. He said, but send Chimham, which appears to be his son. If you look over in 1 Kings 2, verse 7, you see David giving instructions to Solomon to continue to honor the sons of Barzillai because of what he did. So this appears to be a son of Barzillai who will go and be honored there by David. So here they're crossing the Jordan and coming to Gilgal, which is nearby. It's right near Jericho. That's where Judah had waited there as they kind of met on the two, or prepared on the two sides to cross over. They were there at Gilgal. So David now has come over and is there. Okay, so the last few verses here. And behold, all the men of Israel came to the king and said unto the king, why have our brethren, the men of Judah, stolen thee away, and have brought the king and his household, and all David's men with him over Jordan? And all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is near of kin to us. Wherefore then be ye angry for this matter? Have we eaten at all of the king's cost, or hath he given us any gift? And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 parts in the king, and we have also more right in David than ye. Why then did ye despise us, that our advice should not be first had in bringing back our king? And the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. So we have this conflict here now between Israel and Judah. Of course, Israel is the northern tribes. We have this jealousy over the king. And we see in the next chapter, this blows up into another revolt. And in the future, after the death of Solomon, Israel will split along these lines pretty much, except that Benjamin will side with Judah rather than the rest of Israel. You see that in 1 Kings chapter 12, that split where we would be then the divided kingdom. But you see that here in these verses and even before, these jealousies, these conflicts between the tribes. And here they're after each other with this jealousy over the king that Judah went ahead. Israel was the northern tribes were the ones that were first to speak of bringing David back as king, and David had to speak to Judah and say, why are you the last to bring me back? And then Judah runs ahead and is the ones that bring him over the Jordan, and then the rest of Israel is upset that Judah had taken the initiative, even though back here in verse 40 it says half the people of Israel were involved in this conducting the king over. But we end this chapter with this strife between among the tribes over how they dealt with bringing the king back. Everybody's on board with having David as king, it appears at this point, although we see in the next chapter it blows up into another revolt, apparently because of some of these jealousies. At least that's the way it reads as you read through it. So does anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, that's all that I have prepared. We'll prepare for worship now.
Thank you, Ben.